Hello everyone, and just welcome to FreeWord. I'm Eleanor, the Executive Director at FreeWord, and I'm just going to start by welcoming you here today to say thank you for coming. Many of you know FreeWord, but for those of you who don't, we're an international centre for literature, literacy and free expression. We kind of do three things. We have this amazing building here, which is home to another 6 brilliant organisations, and I can see at least Arvon and TLC in the audience, so they can tell you more about FreeWord as well. We also have a year-round programme of events, and we also have our own artistic programme of work, which looks at kind of key issues of our time through literature, literacy and free expression. And I was asked this morning just to say a little something about our own kind of work around environment and sustainability. And there are kind of 3 things that I wanted just to touch on. The first is that for us, it's become a very big part of our artistic programme, and that's quite key. It's quite hard, I think, to think sometimes just practically about environment. It's such a big topic that it felt like just, and I say just, but just changing light bulbs or making ourselves better insulated wasn't enough for us. We wanted to take it artistically as well. So one of our key projects is called How Might We Live Now? And that looks at how we might live more sustainably and more environmentally. We're working at the moment with 5 writers around the world who are looking at climate change and the impact and how they can use storytelling and literature to talk about that. And for the last 2 days, we've had 90 writers in here with scientists talking about climate change and, again, trying to spark their imagination and provide a creative response to environment and sustainability. Alongside that, we are trying very hard to do more and more practical things. We had some redevelopment done in the building last year, and that's been really helpful in terms of making us more environmentally friendly. We now have a draft lobby, little things like that, but actually has made quite a big difference to our energy use. But even there, we're trying to just be a little bit playful and a little bit creative. And we have a great team at FreeWord who enjoy thinking creatively, I think, about it. So we're now looking at things like, we've got a flat roof upstairs, so growing some lavender, which would be nice, but also we can use that lavender to sit in our toilets as a natural scent. So I think we're just trying to find quite playful, quite creative ways of being a bit more sustainable. And the third thing that we're now trying to do, and we are very much at the beginning of this, but I think is quite crucial for us, is thinking about, it's not quite enough just to do the practical bit and the artistic bit, but there's also a communication job as well. And so the other thing we want to do is to start talking more about what we're doing, so that we're doing it, but we're also saying, this is what we're doing, and we would encourage you to do this too. And that is something that we're going to be working on over the next 6 months, and that will be about signage and using our website and really just beginning to say, we're trying these ideas, we're going to try going to Poland in October purely by train. This is how it went. This is how much it cost. If we'd carbon offset rather than flown, would that have been better, cheaper, quicker, or not? So I think from FreeWord's perspective, we are really keen to kind of marry that artistic vision with practice and with communication. And I hope that today is kind of useful as well for all of you in thinking about some of those issues.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and to FreeWord for hosting us today. My name's Shola and I'm arts manager at Julie's Bicycle. I work very closely with Rachel, who's probably been in touch with all of you putting the event today together. And I just wanted to say a few words before handing over to our wonderful speakers this morning. After whom you'll get a chance to join in a discussion, ask questions. We'll have a short break then and take those conversations into smaller groups so that we can really start to get to the bottom of what the practical actions are that we can all take away from today and how we can really draw in some of our colleagues who can't be here with us today to engage them in the conversation and grow this community too. This event is the first of several events that we'll be doing over the next year for different art forms within the Arts Council funded portfolio. This is the first, and it's for literature, obviously, and we're really glad you could all join us here today. These events are really about looking at what the environmental challenges are that face our sector, what the amazing and brilliant responses are that are happening to date, and we'll be hearing from both of our speakers this morning, Peter and Andy, who will speak about that from two different perspectives, and then how we can really start to take those kernels of ideas and seed them all over the sector and within your organisations and beyond. There's obviously some incredible work on climate change that's coming out of the literature sector from our authors and from our creative organisations. And as Eleanor said, this place has been the seat of some of those conversations over the last 2 days, and we've got copies of the latest publication from the Open University called Climate Change Narratives, which you're welcome to help yourselves to. They're the orange books just outside, capturing some of the conversations between authors and practitioners about how we really tell the story of climate change. This event today is really about how we tell the story of climate change within our organisations and the spaces and the festivals where those conversations between authors and audiences and communities happen. And so we're really looking forward to that. I'll have a few practical things to say about the workshops after the panel discussion, but without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our director, Alison Tickell, to talk us through some of the context in which this event sits in terms of environmental sustainability and some of the work that Julie's Bicycle's been doing on attitudes and behaviours towards sustainability in the arts. Alison.
Thank you, Sho. Thanks very much to everybody for coming, and I'll be quick. Very interestingly, last night there was another event. There were two great events. One was the one that was here, and the other was one that was held at the University College London called Time for Change. And it was a group of the country's top scientists who came together for the launch of this report, authored primarily by scientists, but led by Chris Rapley, who some of you may know, who's been an incredible pioneer in terms of communicating climate science. And before I go into this, the key story that came out last night, and hugely contentious, there were a lot of differing views in the room, a lot of heat, was that climate science, as it's currently communicated by scientists, is failing. It's failing to communicate on all sorts of levels. Not only does the story of dystopia fail to communicate agency, but crucially that by working in silos, the scientists are just not able to put across their points. And by making assumptions around things like uncertainty, which for scientists mean one thing, and for the general public it means something quite different, they're inevitably going to be hampered. But the most interesting thing was that this notion of truth, so what the climate scientists consider to be truths, are received by all of us in profoundly different ways. And of course the arts and culture know this deeply. The stuff of our work is all about the representation of complex ideas in very different ways, all sorts of different interpretations, and at the end of the day a piece of art goes out there and is received in a myriad of different ways, and that's the reality of the experience of the arts and culture. This is something that the scientists are just beginning to make their way into, and the biggest headline for us last night was that scientists need to develop narratives, and they need to understand that those narratives mean different things to different people. So they need to really think about what cultural value means in the context of the sciences. absolutely fascinating. This is a brilliant read. It's an absolutely brilliant read. It deals as much with neuroscience and with cultural value as it does with climate change, in fact more so. And it's all about the role of a new set of storytellers. And the primary one, as you might tell from the front, the primary set of storytellers are the arts and culture. So I think that was a fascinating, and the press actually. Media. It was a fascinating experience for me to see just how much our world is going into the ascendancy to deal with to support and help and become part of a solutions-driven community. So very briefly, I'm just going to run through a couple of grounders, I suppose. This phrase, I've heard it about 5 or 6 times recently. I think people are plucking it out because it somehow vindicates this notion of resilience that is absolutely everywhere. Resilience is one of those words. It's a bit like sustainability. It's a bit like culture. It's become a proxy for survival, for everything, and for austerity. And I just wanted to point it out because it's a notion that we all think we agree with, but there's 2 sides of this. There's the living fossils, of which we have many examples of here. We've got the cinnamon ferns, we've got horseshoe crabs, both of which are over 350 million years old and still in a pretty extant form. The wonderful goblin shark that's about 120 million years old, unchanged. And then there's us, who have changed radically over the 400,000 years that we've been on this planet, 200,000 years in our current form. And I just wonder if Darwin would have clarified that statement had he known. He made that statement around here. And had he been aware of this, which is where we are now. So this is 2000, and all of these, I'm sorry you can't see them, but all of these, this is species extinction, which starts around 1900. This is paper consumption, which is particularly pertinent for publishing. There's population, there's greenhouse gases, there's all the things that we know about. But it's a very instrumental chart because it tells us when this starts, which was after the whole notion of modern evolution had been framed. And very recently, this year, we had a NASA-funded study which said that we would have a collapsed civilization within decades. And in our own national UK Government Office for Science, this came out a couple of years ago, suggested that in 2030, the perfect storm of energy, food, water, climate, population would create a similar collapse. So I always feel it's difficult, this context setting, but it's very, very important that we do also recognise that while there is absolutely a playfulness to this, there is also the undercurrent of that playfulness is absolutely critical, and that we do need to remind ourselves of just the gravity of where we are. That is why we need to be deploying this incredible effort around creativity. And the great thing is, this slightly cheesy but rather wonderful quote, it's often in the darkest skies that we see the brightest stars. And I think now these bright stars need to be, and indeed are, in the ascendancy, and particularly and interestingly from the arts and culture. And I would say particularly from parts of it, including our writers and our poets. There's a wonderful poem in the loo, in the ladies' loo, so the men might not see it unless you sneak in. We'll forgive you. It's called Frog, and it's by somebody called Kathleen James, and it's about 2 frogs mating who then get squashed by a car. It's quite tragic, actually, but it's a beautiful poem, and I think it's part of a series of poems that are here. So I just wanted to take this idea of green, and I wanted to put our own take on it, which is what we need to do is to develop a balanced, mutually beneficial relationship within our socio-ecological context. it's a very all-encompassing phrase, but for me it feels that it says what it is, what sustainability needs to be. It's a big one, but it's all about balance. That is balance with ourselves, and of course, critically, it is balance with the planet. And I think we in the creative industries, and one of my big things at the moment, one of my big sort of realizations is that this is not about sector responses, even though we're all here in the context of literature. This really is about creativity and about the creative industries. That we in the creative industries really do have a very special purchase on it. There's this wonderful Maya Angelou quote: "You can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have." And if we look at the sector that, this is slightly, sorry, it's not quite in there, the sector that the creative sector represents, it's pretty comprehensive. It's design. And I think literature has a place in all of this. Design, advertising, media and broadcast, film, fashion, games, music, performing arts, literature, visual arts, museums and heritage. That is the expression of our creative industries, and it's a magnificent set of arts, cultures, creative endeavours that we have at our fingertips. And we do indeed have the potential to transform our individual and our collective ways of being. And that is the scale of this incredible journey that we are all on. One of the things that we're hearing in Robert's book, in Robert Ashton's book, the book that was published last night in the Where Science Meets Art, in the general rhetoric is that what we need to do here is not tackle a particular issue, but actually we need to rethink how we think of ourselves in relation to the world in which we live. And what Julie's Bicycle has been doing, in a sense, to distance ourselves from being purely utilitarian, which is only applying a practical approach, which I think is really critical, but also to start to gather some of this amazing creativity and start to act as part of this extraordinary world. We've started to do some work around a new program called Sustaining Creativity. Our aim is to accelerate a holistic rethinking of how the creative community responds to climate change and environmental sustainability in all its many forms. And that's practical. It's looking at investment, it's looking at artistic inspiration, it's looking at our relationship with our communities, with our audiences, and above all, it's looking at how we might work together to do something really exciting. We started this very briefly. We started this with a survey that some of you will have been a part of, and I just wanted to touch on the findings. We surveyed leaders from across the cultural sector, mainly the organisations and bodies that we've been working with most closely, which represents roughly the arts and culture. We reached an audience of 70 million, a turnover of over £1 billion, combined arts, dance, literature, museums, music, theatre and visual arts, England, Scotland and Wales, and a very diverse mix of art forms. And the findings were essentially that there are very high levels of engagement across the arts and culture. 55% of organisations have achieved financial and 40% have achieved reputational benefits, and yet sustainability is still not core business. So that's very, very interesting. There's a gap between benefits that are actually being reached and a sense that this is something that's absolutely critical to your business modelling. And 62% of our arts leaders consider it to be something that will become more important. This is a really interesting one for me. Climate change risk and governance are the lowest drivers of change, which means that we haven't managed, Julie's Bicycle and all the other committed organisations have not yet managed to put climate change risks and sustainability in its broader sense, which includes all the incredible opportunities to rethink both our industrial and our creative infrastructure. We have not managed to put that at the level that it needs to be. Leadership is coming from the middle, all those amazing green champions that are driving change. There are 65 leading organisations, and this is another big one for us, of which 63% are from the Arts Council National Portfolio Organisation cohort. This proves to us that compliancy and policy does work, that if you create no choice, people move into a different relationship to I know that's contentious for many. There is a very, very strong appetite to take a lead through peer groupings, knowledge transfer. Half of organisations have created work on this theme, and virtually everybody believes it's relevant to them. But there is still a very persistent gap between people's values and how that's represented through what they do, the so-called value action gap. Now, we did do a snapshot of literature, and I think this is interesting. It was a very small sample, 4%, because actually it's quite, in relation to the others, it's a small sector. 54% of respondents have an environmental policy which is the lowest across the cohort. The highest was visual arts. There is a strong engagement with suppliers. So how you deal with your contractors and your supply chain, there is high engagement along that. But literature perceives that it does more than most. 31% of literature consider themselves to do more than other sectors, whereas the reality is if you look at our indices of what constitutes action, it's actually the lowest proportion. So there's an interesting gap there around perceptions of what literature does and actually what it does in reality, and we hope to be able to bridge some of those gaps. You have the highest proportion of people who consider it not relevant. Now, not relevant to your business. I think a success metric for us is to say, well, let's make it relevant. Okay. But that is in the context of half of you thinking it is relevant. So that's a much smaller proportion. 67 think it's got more important to your organisations over the last 2 years, and 70%, which is the highest, think it will get more important. I suspect that might be something around the fact that there's quite a lot still to be done. Overall drivers are similar to others, but you are least engaged around your mission. So that was great to hear Eleanor talking about how important it is becoming to Free Word. And least concerned about the effects of climate change on your organisations. And you have also seen the smallest financial benefit, and very often those two are very closely related. Only 23% of you have seen reputational benefits, and again, we'd really like to see that change. And nevertheless, at 70%, the highest number of people have shared their personal visions for sustainability. So there's some very interesting stats there. I think there is some work to be done, but I think we have the context in which that work has every reason to succeed. And we've understood that the more you understand about the nature of the problem, the less you perceive yourself to be leading, and that is because it is a very complex problem, and it will affect every aspect of your business, and I suspect that's got something to do with perception. So I'm going to finish now. This was a wonderful piece of literature, actually, that was picked up from a loo in Paris. The earth without art is just there's all sorts of poetry around those 5 really interesting letters. And I just wanted to finish with this, again, very cheesy picture of the planet. And the reason I wanted to finish with this is that it's dawned on me very recently that we've only got one of these. People are always talking about life in other parts of our endlessly expanding universe. It's not been found. And if it has been found, it certainly won't look very like this. So I know it's a picture everybody's seen hundreds of times, but I just think it's worth remembering that there's probably only one of these. And we have such a wonderful, fantastic, inspiring relationship to it. And people in this room particularly are such incredible custodians of making what is wonderful about that planet so explicit to all of us. So for me, it's one of those calls to get cracking. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you for listening. We now have 2 fantastic speakers who've both done an awful lot. And I'm going to hand over to Sho to introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I'm just going to quickly switch over to Andy's presentation, and by a very quick way of introduction, Andy Friars is director of Hay on Earth at the Hay Festival. Andy has an honours degree in environmental science for many years. He joined the Forestry Commission as a ranger in East Anglia in the 90s, spent years as the Forest of Dean Chief Ranger, and moved to Wales as Recreation Advisor for Wales in 2003. And since 2007, he's been Hay on Earth's director with the Hay Festival, and has been involved with the festival for many years, since 1995. He's also director of the Hay Festival Maldives event and the Winter Weekend director. And he's also been working recently on secondment with Powys County Council as part of an EU-funded project, ZEN, which is investigating the ways of reducing and mitigating the negative impacts of events and festivals whilst maximising the benefits. So without further ado, Andy.
Thank you. And thanks for coming. Hopefully you have all heard of Hay, because you are working in the literature field, so I hope you have at least heard about us. Am I just clicking to move on? Just there. There we go. Got it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you a brief introduction to the festival, what we do, where we work, and then more about what I do in terms of Hay on Earth and sustainability, and the sort of areas in which we try to work in. Hay Festival. This is a sort of during shot, so you can see we built this big tented village on the outskirts of Hay. It started in 1987. Do you want me to speak into that? Okay. No problem. Sorry, I move around a lot. Okay. Right, there we go. Hay was started in 1987. It was a much smaller event then, only took place over one weekend, and was essentially a gathering of friends over that weekend. And since then it's developed. In Hay itself, it's now 11 days long. We have around about 800 different events taking place over those 11 days. It's around about, this year we did around about 235,000 ticket sales, and this all takes place in a town which normally has a population of 1,500 people. So Hay on Wye, which you may know, is known as the Book Town. It's the second-hand bookshop capital of the world. It's now got something like 39 second-hand bookshops. So it's a excellent place to be working in literature and books. The festival itself has expanded on from being just about literature. We call ourselves now much more of a festival of ideas, and we work across all the cultural sectors, from politics through to comedy, music, writing, history, environmental, you name it, we'll pretty much cover it. Essentially, what you see here is, left-hand side is we built this massive tented village. It's not actually that big, it's only covers about 10 acres or so. And this is an aerial shot afterwards of just about 4 weeks after the festival finished. So that's taken about a week ago now. And within about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, the sheep will be back on there, and it turns back into a sheep field for the rest of the year. So it's we have this sort of very transient impact on Hay itself during sort of 2 month period where the build takes place. Festival's 11 days. Thousands of people come in, thousands of people leave, and Hay gets back to normal again. But over that period, we as a festival have a big impact, both economically, clearly, both environmentally and also socially. So we take those. I've just broken your office. I'm disappearing it down underneath. Just lost my train of thought. Anyway, so we have a big impact. So as a result of that, we try to mitigate those impacts. Moving on, there we go. Before I go into those impacts, in 1997 we did our first international festival when our director Peter Florence worked very closely with Mantova in Italy in setting up the festival in Italy there. But since then we now run festivals all over the world. The top left-hand one is in a cave in Spain, in Segovia. The right-hand one is our festival in Nairobi in Kenya. Bottom left is our Maldives festival. Bottom right is our Colombian festival. We also run festivals in Mexico, Beirut, Bangladesh, India, Hungary, and Ireland. And Ireland's in 2 weeks' time. Next week? 2 weeks' time. We're back in Kells. And these festivals all follow a similar sort of format. They're not as big as the main festival, but they all take place in beautiful locations. We invite a mixture of the best local authors and speakers and writers, mix that in with a little blend of international people, and try and have a good time exploring new ideas. So wherever we are in the world, we try and have that similar ethos. It's about celebrating the best, bringing together people in a place where they can be relaxed, where they can enjoy themselves, where they can be open to new ideas, and where they can learn something and go away inspired. So it doesn't matter where you are, that's still hopefully the ethos, and that's what people take away with them. So what is Hay on Earth? This is my... I joined Hay Festival in about 8 years ago now, and I'd just gone part-time with the Forestry Commission because I wanted to take a break and do something different. And Peter Florence, who we knew very well, said, "Will you come and lead on this new initiative to try and make Hay Festival more sustainable?" So we came up with the Hay on Earth project, which has 3 overall objectives. And the first objective is our own impacts. What do we do in terms of the overall management of the festival, and what can we do to try and change the way we work? And so we broke that down into a range of different options, different things we do, looked at, right from the beginning, from looking at how we contract our goods and services, where we buy our things from. So we have a little festival shop here. So where do we get our stuff from? Where do we buy in our services? Where do we buy in our contracts? Our marquee supplier, what sort of environmental policy have they got for all that carpet which they take away afterwards? Where does that stuff ending up? What do they do about it? So our supplies and services is one of the first areas we looked at. We looked at our waste. Clearly, with any festival, there's a huge amount of waste which is generated. And so we worked very closely with an organisation at the time called Culch, which was an event recycling organisation in Wales, which has since folded, and now they're part of WRAP, which you probably may well have heard of. But WRAP we work very closely with now. And we have a whole recycling team who will come and we put our bins out, and then back of house is the dirty job when they've actually got to do what the public should have done in the first place of sorting it again. But that meant this year we hit around about 75% recycling of all of our waste. So we've still got some way to go before we can get to a zero waste, but we're moving in that direction. One of the big areas we explored this year was one of the things about festivals is people concentrate on the actual event and they forget about the setup and the takedown. It's like all things. People will get excited about the whole thing, and afterwards everyone's going, "Oh God, that was good." Off they go. And you've got this period when everything has to be taken down. And that's when actually we look at most events and festivals where most waste is generated. So you've got all the people who have been at the festival all just go. Whether they're suppliers, whether they are display people, whether they're punters, they just go and leave stuff. We've all seen those photographs of Glastonbury when everyone's gone. It's just a sea of litter. People just want to go home and just, leave stuff behind. So we've this year we focused with our we had people employed to actually be on site for the 2 weeks of takedown after the festival, and as a result we moved from having 12 skips going to landfill to 1 skip going to landfill this year. So dramatic change, and that's not just a great impact in terms of recycling waste, but also financially. Now skips, this is all interesting stuff to people who are interested, but a skip for landfill now is about £300 a skip. A skip for recycling is about £100 a skip. Massive difference in cost. So even though we've employed someone for 2 weeks to actually be there and do that work, we've made a massive saving just on stopping stuff going to landfill. So there's a financial benefit, and there's also a environmental benefit just from focusing on those sorts of things. Water, and you may have seen the news this week, Glastonbury are banning the plastic bottle, finally, but instead they're having metal bottles instead. I'm not quite sure on the environment. Anyway, we banned the plastic bottle about 5 years ago, and we've been working with our water partner, Welsh Water, and we have these standpipes around site where you can come along and refill your water bottles. It's a small, in our sort of festival, it's a fairly small impact because we're not on the Glastonbury scales, but it's all takes people along the journey, and people get used to then coming and refilling. One of the things we don't do is greenwash. I'm a strong believer in not doing things just because they look right. And some things just don't work in our size of festival. Because we're 11 days long, using solar PV generators is just not practical. A solar PV generator, that's the one that actually powers it from the sun, only lasts about a weekend, so we'd have to be constantly reusing new generators coming up and actually essentially going back onto the grid. But what we do is, where we can, we trial using things like solar thermal panels on top of some of our units to see if it makes a difference. This year, with the rain, it's made absolutely no difference whatsoever, and we've basically relied on the gas to heat our water. We have to have a backup system, but it's about trying these systems, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work. If it doesn't work, fine, we'll find something else, or we'll go back to what works. But essentially, we've still got to deliver a top-class event for those 235,000 ticket buyers. So that's sort of a little bit about the sort of what we do in terms of the practical, the impact that we have. What can we do to make change internally? The biggest area where we have an impact is the people who come to the festival. And that's the same wherever you go. People coming to this event here will have had far more impact on the environment than the actual putting on the event within this building itself. Transport being the number one issue there. When we did our CO2 survey in 2009, I think we did our last big one, our overall impact, the festival then, was about 700 tonnes of CO2 emission, approximately for our own direct management of the festival. People coming to the festivals are around about 7,000 tonnes of CO2. So about a tenfold difference between actually putting our festival on as opposed to all the people coming. Now you can argue, and I do argue, that it's half-term week, people are going to be travelling somewhere, people are going to be going on holiday. So that you could say, well, that they're going to be travelling anyway, so why should we bother? It's important to understand that and take account of that, so you don't get too guilty about it. At the same time, it's important to see there where you can mitigate and what you can do to try and reduce that. If they are going to come, let's see what we can do to try and make the change so that we're reducing those impacts as they come. So Hay on Wye, for those who've been or not been, will know. Well, no, you've definitely not been. You might. If you have been, you will know. It's in the middle of Wales, on the edge of the border there. It's not got a great public transport system. There's no railway station. The nearest one is about 40 minutes away. The bus service is pretty crap, like most of the rural bus services. Everyone relies on the car to a greater or lesser degree. So we've been working now for 5-6 years now with a private bus operator. The last 3 years has been with First Direct in the Midlands, and we put on 10 buses every day going from the Hereford bus station to Hay. So you can now get a through ticket, you buy a ticket from London or wherever, jump on the train, get your through ticket all the way down to Hay Festival. Now we run that scheme with them. We underwrite the cost of the buses, and then we do a profit share on any money which is made after that. And each year we have made, both of us, the private operator and ourselves, have shared in a reasonable return on that bus service. So it does pay. Public transport can actually pay its way. Each year we're seeing increases in numbers of people using that service. And this year we had about 2,500 to 3,000 people on that bus. Now it's still a small percentage of overall users, but it's making a change. And there's two things which it's doing. One is it is offering an opportunity for people not to come by car, which is great for the environment, but also from our social engagement, from the social aspect of the festival, it's opening the festival up people who don't drive, who can't drive. So actually you can now get to the festival, and so in terms of, so if you can't drive, which is important for us to ensure accessibility. We also have two other bus networks within the festival. We had the one which gets you to Hereford, which I just explained. We've then got a little one which goes around town. And then we realised about 5 years ago that, of course, if you get to Hay by bus and you need to get out to your B&Bs or your hotels around the area and you haven't got your car, then you're a bit stuffed. So we put on these what we call the village shuttles, first with Sky, who were our partner then, and they helped us by giving us some minibuses, and then the last couple of years we've been doing it directly, and we have now village shuttles, which will go about once every 2 hours, will go off around the local villages, just do drop-off and pickups, just to enable people, either if you've come by car, you can leave your car and get into site, or if you haven't come by car, you can get out to your accommodation in the roundabout. So it's about trying to make it easier for people. It's about trying to facilitate access through transport. We also do some other things, such as the cycle rickshaw. It doesn't make a massive impact, but they did carry about 2,000 people for the mile they were operating on, which is still quite considerable for that period. We obviously push car sharing, and this year I've been talking with Cardiff University. We're going to try and do a project where we're linking up people who've bought. We also do a postcode analysis of all of our ticket sales. We're going to try and do a linking up of people who have got. We do a postcode sort of search and link people up directly. So they'll get a little email saying, do you know that 5 miles away from you there's someone else coming to the festival on the same day? Maybe you'd like to car share. And that's partly because our audience are not in the older upper ranges of the human age limits. Not always, but we have quite a span, but there is certainly an older generation there, and not as used to using things like Go Car Share or blah blah car sharing apps. So if we can actually directly email them and put them in touch with each other, they're maybe more likely to make the change. So it's things like that which we're trying to make that impact. And transport, as I said, is the biggest impact we have. So I should have said actually that the objective 2 is basically looking at how we make the changes for the people who are coming. That's what objective 2 is about. So the other area, of course, is accommodation. When you've come here, so what we're trying to do is work with our accommodation providers. We don't own any accommodation ourselves. Wow, that was quick. We don't own any accommodation ourselves. So we try and work with those accommodation providers to actually give us to help them with their sustainability. Right, I'm going to rattle through this last objective. And it's a shame because actually this is the biggest one. This is the most exciting one. This is where we get the opportunity to spread the word. And I think one of the key things that festivals and events can do, and you talk about it just now about what Free Word can do, is talk about what you do and use the opportunity of getting people together to actually spread messages. So one of my key areas as Director of Hay on Earth is looking at how do I program events and debates and conferences and things taking place during the festival. So if you're coming all the way to Hay, you can come and see something which will hopefully send you away afterwards and make change. And these are just some examples. This is Andrew Sims, works for the New Economics Foundation, now works for Global Witness, and Marcus Brigstocke, comedian, talking about sustainability, talking about what sustainability means for them. Down this bottom left-hand side, we did a project called Just Fashion this year with Environmental Justice Foundation and Levi's and Central San Martin, where we had 9 students come up working on sustainable fashion. They spent a whole 5 days designing stuff, and then we had Catherine Hamlet and Dilys Williams from Central San Martin come up. We did an event, a little cat show, and they had a chance to come and talk about sustainable fashion. This one here, we have run this program now for called Green Dragons. It was called Green Dragons, it's now called Future Dragons, where we have you can bid in for up to it's £10,000, and 5 winning bids will then come up and they can present to the public. We have 4 dragons and the public get a vote, and it's all around sustainable communities. And this is the example. The top one, the 2 joined these 2 here. It was a project called Bee-Bug, and it's about trying to develop a electric vehicle for use around the national park. The top one is their original prototype, and that's the minister and me sitting in it after some publicity stuff. After that, they won £10,000, and they've gone on to develop this new network called the Eco Travel Network around the national park, and they're now using these Renault Twizzys, which you may well see around. These are production cars. You probably can't see us, John Barrowman, doing a bit of promo stuff for us in it. But they now have this network of 20 Twizzys around the national park, which you can go, and 50 recharge points. So that sort of thing comes out of the festival. So by using that opportunity of bringing people together, both the combination of bringing names, bringing media, bringing the public together, you can actually make some big change. The bottom left, the middle section one is just a example of what we do in terms of some of our community outreach. we've done offsetting with SolarAid, who convert kerosene lamps to solar lamps. But one of the things we wanted to do was try to ensure that some of our offsetting actually took place within the community which we are. And this is so about 3 years ago we bought a thermal imaging camera, and it's now available for any people within the community and the wider area to use to do thermal surveys of their houses or their buildings or their schools. And we've worked with Transition Towns, Hay, so they can go off and they can do their surveying. So it's part of it's difficult to capture exactly how much offsetting that makes, but it does make a difference because we know that you can make that change. And one of the things I don't spend hours doing bean counting. I'd much rather say, okay, let's see if we can make a difference. Let's inspire. Let's make that change. We know it's going to make a change. I can't say exactly how much it's going to make, but it will make a change. Let's keep that moving forward. Just very quickly to finish, and this is, you all recognise the Fonz, Henry Winkler, who was at the festival this year, one of the most inspiring speakers I've seen in years, just phenomenal guy, had 3,000 kids in the palm of his hand, and then another 1,200 adults afterwards. Just really inspiring, and what we try and do is inspire people. That's what we're about. As well as making our own changes, as well as trying to walk the walk, we also try and encourage other people to walk it as well. We work in I'm running over time, I know. I'm on the floor, so you can't get rid of me. We do programs with Park Prison, where we take authors into prisons. We do work with schools and universities, taking authors into those spaces. It's just as important to look at what you do inside as it is to take what you do outside as well. I know we're talking after as well, so I'm going to stop there. There's loads more, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Andy, and I'm sure there's going to be lots and lots we can pick up on our both in the discussion afterwards and the breakout groups. So I'm going to just rush forward and introduce Peter Hughes, who's the chair of the Publishers Association's Environmental Review Group. Peter is Director of Corporate Responsibility for Pearson, one of the world's leading learning companies, and he has overall responsibility for their lead on environmental and supply chain management issues. So the purpose of the ERG is to spread awareness within the book industry of the environmental impacts of publishing, and he has a huge amount of expertise and knowledge, which he'll be sharing with us now and throughout today. So without further ado, over to you, Peter.
Thank you. I may not be quite as tall as Andy. So is that all right from a sound point of view? Maybe not. Yep, that's fine. So, well, thank you very much to Julie's Bicycle for the invitation. It's a great honour to be here. Environmental sustainability in the literature sector in 15 minutes. Quite a big ask. So what I'll try and do is give you a flavour of some of the work that the publishing industry has been doing, and hopefully that will help stimulate some ideas and thoughts on sort of questions for the discussion. So I thought I'd cover sort of four sort of key areas. The first is what I think might be the unique contribution that literature can make to environmental issues. The second was to talk about how the industry has collaborated to try and deal with some of the more intractable environmental issues. Third, to introduce you to the Publishers Green Network as an opportunity to get involved in a grassroots organisation. And then fourth, to say just a little bit about ebooks. So the first bit, unique contribution, and this sort of picks up on some things that Alison was saying. I'd like to just start by asking you to do something. In the last 12 months, if you've bought a book, whether that's physical or ebook, can you just raise your hands? I'd be shocked with this audience. if you hadn't purchased books, so that's great to see that you have. Second, if you've bought a book with a green or environmental theme, whether that's fiction or non-fiction in the last 12 months, can you raise your hands? Okay, so about 2/3 of you, that's great. Finally, if you've bought a fiction book on climate change or the environment, put up your hand. So 5 or 6 of you. And that's sort of, I think, to reinforce sort of some of the opportunity for the literature sector. Also, I'm talking about scientists and sort of their view on this particular issue. They're fairly clear about we as a society are moving into an age of consequences, and they set out the challenges around glaciers going back, extreme weather events, impact on sort of geopolitical stability and all that. But scientists will absolutely say they are not very good at connecting with people. And if you look back at history, some of the things which have been most powerful about changing anything has been books. You know, whether it's slavery, gender equality, how you deal with mental health, the ability to tell stories in an engaging way is clear. I think we've had this as a theme right through now, but I guess the message for the literature sector is, if there's a great book coming out there your way, grab hold of it and publish it, because it might make a huge difference. So the second thing I was going to talk about was how the industries collaborated together to deal with intractable problems. And one of the really interesting things about publishing is actually, of all the sectors that I've come across, it's one of the most collaborative, and one of the places where people do come together to solve issues. Now, the history of the Environmental Action Group Review Group at the Publishers Association is quite an interesting one. It was started in 2007 by Helen Fraser, who was then the managing director of Penguin, and she was also the president of the Publishers Association. And her sort of view contention was quite a sort of simple one. It was that green issues were about to hit the publishing industry like a train. That was her view in 2007. And that the industry needed to act. That was sort of very quickly followed up by the UK passing a really important piece of legislation, which committed us to reduce our climate footprint by 80% by 2050 using a 1990 baseline, which is actually like a massive sort of thing to sort of commit to do. So there was lots of energy and sort of change at that time that needed to be acted upon. So the Publishers Association convened something which for them was really unique. It was a group which involved not only publishers, but also benefit from the Booksellers Association, printers, and members of the Booksellers Association, to give a sort of end-to-end view. They started with this massive, we are going to change the world and do everything agenda, starting with covering sort of things like returns, waste recycling, energy use, climate change, and all that. But they soon sort of identified sort of 4 sort of key intractable problems that they wanted to address. The first one was the structure of sort of the literature sector. There were a number of very big players, but there were also a lot of small publishers, small booksellers, who wouldn't necessarily have the information and tools to be able to respond and understand what their impacts were. So together, the group put together something called Green for Books, which was a tool to help sort of measure and identify what your impact was. Because knowing where you start is the way to start to make a difference. The second sort of a big intractable problem was what impact are we having as an industry? What is our product carbon footprint? Again, if you don't understand that and where it's coming from, how can you start to make sort of measures to improve? So to tackle that, 10 or so of the members, including printers with Clays and the Booksellers Association, got together to create something called the Book Carbon Tool, which had the sort of small objective of mapping the course of the book from the forest to the distribution centre of the publisher, passing through the printer along its way. That tool sort of focused initially on A format, B format and hardback black and white books, which for the trade fiction world is certainly for Penguin, which is 47% owned by Pearson, was about a third of what was published. What we found from that was that around 10% of the footprint was something that we directly controlled ourselves. The other 90% was in the supply chain. And sort of in order of importance, it was paper, where does that come from? Print, and then sort of the distribution. So, why does understanding all that matter? Well, one thing that Penguin was able to do was to look at its paper suppliers. And by shifting from one paper supplier in Finland to Sweden, it was able to reduce the carbon footprint of the book by half. So that was sort of 3 times its own sort of impact through the buildings that it operates in the UK by making a supply chain decision. The sort of third intractable problem is that sort of paper piece. Now, and forests and climate change, and when you think about environmental impact, you can't get away from, we use quite a lot of trees. And how can you do that responsibly? For people like B&Q, where you have sort of, garden furniture, it's easier because you're getting a lump of wood and you can track that sort of very straightforwardly. But when it comes to a paper, which has pulps from various sources, different parts of the world, lots of mills, and although we are a significant user of paper, we do only account for 1 or 2% of the global paper industry usage. How do you get at that information? The way of doing that was to work together as an industry. So something called PREPS, the Publishers Database for Responsible Paper Sourcing, was created, and it now has 26 members from the publishing industry in it. And what they did was to use a system that Egmont put together to grade papers, and then use the entire industry to go out to mills to say, we'd really like to know information about what makes up our papers, so we can understand how responsibly this is being managed. So the database will have the information around the pulps, countries of origin, tree species, and importantly, what sort of certifications might be held, to help provide information for publishers to make informed decisions. And that's starting to develop by adding information around water use and the climate footprint for different mills as an extension. Buoyed by that sort of collaborative success, there's another group called PIPS, which, if I can remember it rightly, it's Publishers Something Product Safety, which is looking at not just product safety issues, but also things like glue, binding, covers, chemical use, and to understand what the best options are. The fourth sort of intractable issue is how do you engage, enthuse, excite, and inform people? The Environmental Review Group was not the body to do that because its members are drawn from sort of production heads, people like myself with this corporate responsibility portfolio, or communications people from publishers. And what we needed was something which was a grassroots body of people who were enthusiastic from the middle, as Alison would put it, which would help change practice within our sort of buildings, but also to hold the Environmental Review Group to account. So there is a network called the Publishers Green Network, which meets on a regular basis to review and talk about sort of issues and share best practice and share ideas, so that good practice can be shared. And if anyone is interested in that and would like contact details of the Secretariat, let me know. So the fourth sort of area I said I'd touch on was books and e-books. There is a sort of real challenge here in that for the book supply chain, it's quite complex but simple at the same time. We know it starts in a forest, it'll go to a pulp mill, it'll go to a paper mill, print, get to a distribution centre, to a bookshop, with sort of distributions at each stage. And we can and have been able to work with our suppliers to get information, to be able to map what that looks like in carbon terms. Now, for the digital piece, it's completely different. There's a design component, there's a storage element, sometimes in sort of service, sometimes out there in the cloud. There's a distribution piece, and then there's the user device interface. And unlike a book, where it's a book and you read it, your device can do lots of very different things. So understanding the user engagement is very hard. So comparing the two is very difficult. 3 or 4 years ago, there was a sort of presumption that book bad, physical book, e-book good. The information now suggests that it's much more nuanced and that the environmental arguments are very open, in part because the information that's out there on digital footprint is not what it could be. Those are sort of, just some thoughts on areas to cover. In terms of the industry and where we're going next, the Environmental Review Group, the Publishers Green Network, and BIC, the supply chain body for the industry, we're all going to be getting together next month to talk about where do we go next, what would the future look like. So to help sort of prepare that, I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, your views and your challenges to help inform our discussion around what might be useful. And I think, is that all right? Is that 15 minutes? Okay. Thank you.
So, if Alison and Ali could join Peter, and I think there's something with some mics here as well. We have got a roving mic, and I know we're in quite a small room and you can probably hear everything without it, but it'd be great if you could, if you have a question or comment, wait for the microphone before you speak. I know there's several of you actually submitted topics and themes you would quite like to pick up on today, and now is one of the moments for you to do that. Of course, you can pick it up in the breakouts as well, but are there any questions from the floor? Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, we're a very small literary consultancy whereby editors and manuscript assessments across the country read written work basically and feedback editorials, advice, and then we get stuff out to agents. But I think hopefully the breakout group about publishing and e-publishing after this session will drill down into some detail. But it's the e-book issue. I mean, my instinct always was it was far too neat just to say, oh great, we're all saved. There's the e-book, but is it the storage of the cloud stuff that is really scary? That the cloud itself is getting bigger and bigger and incredibly vulnerable, and sitting in the middle of an Arizona desert somewhere and about to Margaret Atwood, I think, has written a dystopia where, you know, we just lose everything all at one time and then we all have to start again. I mean, you know, I mean, it's not really a question so much. Well, it is a question. I mean, unless we're going to hear more about specificities about ebooks in the next breakout session, and you don't want to go into it here, I'd be interested to hear more about what we know or don't know about that. Paper, print, paper or ebook, basically.
Why don't you?
Okay. So on paper, we know so much more than we do the ebook equivalent.
Why?
You know, and I think partly that's to do with some of the players within the industry and how transparent they are. So on the devices side, I think Apple are alone in putting out some environmental information, and their device is you know, more complicated and has many different users compared to something which is just simply sort of an ebook reader. So we just don't have some of the information we need. But you're absolutely right to point out the cloud. It's just like, it used like massive amounts of electricity. It's like the third largest user of electricity globally. It's just tremendous. And I think we are starting to see an understanding of that as an issue. And you know, people like Google have made commitments around becoming climate neutral, and have made some moves towards investments. But I think we're at their very early stages.
Can I add to that as well? There's very similar things in other parts of the creative industries. Obviously, the more digital we become, the more we need to look at this. And one of the most difficult things, we were part actually of a group which included some publishers, the Guardian Green. It was a green sustainable publishing group, and one of the big issues around digital work is our use of it, the use phase. Where, we have huge problems about transparency. So Peter's absolutely right. That information is very difficult to come by because there's commercial sensitivities around it. But the biggest problem is actually how we use our devices, and we tend to keep them on all the time, multiple devices on all the time. Often with the same information on it, and every time we open a computer, effectively we're activating those as live living sources, you know, drawers of our energy. And that there is also this very difficult issue around the devices themselves and where they're produced. So there's issues around conflict and rare metals and you know, a lot of that. And so it is one of the most difficult areas. We did a lot of research for the music industry in the context of when it was first emerging that the digital world was going to overtake the physical world. And the full cycle, life cycle analysis, it seems, and I think this is still the case, that actually digital might be even more intensive because of the use phase. So there's things like in music, a typical owner of music would own about 8,000 pieces of music. Now digital owners, they own about between 20 and 30,000, all of which might be sitting on multiple platforms, which every time you open them, they're being used. So it is, it's as much to do with us and our approach to this new world that we find at our fingertips as it is to do with the energy that's actually used at all points of that supply chain. So it's very difficult.
But forgive my naivety, but if the government are insisting that companies are accountable, how on earth are Amazon and Google and the rest of them managing to evade it? And surely that's a lobbying issue. You know, the single most important thing we should be doing is lobbying that they do disclose that information. Otherwise, we're all in the dark, and now we have to make decisions about what we suggest. Anyway, immediate observation, I'll let other people speak, but it's a big one, isn't it?
It's a huge one.
Yeah.
It's a huge one because it's not just affecting, obviously, it's not affecting literature, it's affecting all the creative industries and many other industries. I mean, if we look at what's happening to our practical infrastructure, so much of it now is being sourced on the internet.
If we knew which direction to lobby, you knew which direction to lobby in, you could encourage. You have to know what to passionately encourage, and it might be live events at the expense of everything else, which is what it's sounding like. It's sounding kind of hopeless. If the cloud is a problem, that's not about to disappear.
But it is also an opportunity, isn't it? I mean, it's not all. I mean, the opportunity to actually get messages to a much wider audience, the digital, opportunity is massive. The question is how do you prioritise which bits do you put digital and which bits do you keep as real, per se.
The big question for me is which messages are you to? What are the messages? And there's still a lack of clarity. What are the if somebody says you've got to go out and encourage every writer you work with or every editor that you're working with to think differently, that's fine. But until we know what we're encouraging them to do, it's terribly hard to act. And if I knew that it was never read either a digital book or a normal book again, but just go back to oral storytelling, I'd advocate for that. But it's terribly difficult to know what to advocate for. And so I'm hoping that today will bring some further clarity around that. But it's huge, isn't it? I know you know that. No, of course there are opportunities. I presume you don't think it's a hopeless cause and that in 2030 it's all going to blow up anyway.
No. It's a great question, actually, and I was just going to kick off, unless anybody wants to ask something now, asking both Andy and Peter. One of the things that we're grappling with, and I think you've pointed out really beautifully in both the question and the response to it, is actually about the future. So we are now moving very rapidly, and the rise of Hay, not just in terms of itself as a festival, but also in terms of its international profile, and indeed the changes, and that was fantastic to hear about just what's happened after what Helen managed to stimulate in terms of the publishing industry. There's a very rapid move forward in terms not just of sustainability, but also in terms of the business itself. And I wondered if you could both give us a snapshot into what you feel are going to be the key drivers for your respective parts of your sectors over the next 5 years, and where sustainability, if you feel it's on the ascendant, and therefore what are the critical issues for sustainability over the next 5 to 10 years. Perhaps we'll start with you, Andy.
I think we're at the point really where we need some very firm legislation. Now I know red tape is not one of those lovely buzzwords that people like, but I see ourselves here, well, in fact, for the last 3 or 4 years now, we're at the same place we were with the health and safety legislation back in the 60s, where from the sort of 1900s forwards, you started to get enlightened employers doing the right thing. They would make sure that their employees were looked after. They would make sure they had safety equipment. They weren't killed coming to work. That was seen as something which is enlightening to do. And then it got to the point after several big industrial accidents that the government decided actually enough was enough. We need to set a bar. And they created the Health and Safety Employment Act, which actually set that bar at a certain level and said all employers must now reach this level. You cannot have any excuse to go below that. And I think we are at the same point, we have been now for several years now, where with sustainability, we're a similar sort of issue. There are people who are doing the right thing, who are trying who are doing things because it's the right thing to do, but there are many who aren't, and there's a number of reasons why they're not doing it. But I think we are at the point now where there has to be that bar needs to be set to say, actually, by now, guys, you should all be here. There's no excuse to be down here,
Can
muddling
I ask
in
you,
the
Andy,
water.
though, just to be provocative, and anybody please do join in. Obviously, I would agree with that, and I don't know if the room would agree, but we do live in an environment at the moment whereby legislation is actually being rolled away from sustainability, particularly in this country, and we can see what is going on in the States, how much resistance Obama has to creating some kind of framework around fossil fuel use and some kind of taxation system. And indeed in Australia it's disappeared altogether. So we do have a very counterintuitive environment, a legislative environment globally as well as nationally.
I think you're right, and when I say legislation, what I mean is It's like rules and regulations. It doesn't have to be legislation. And well, there's a very easy way. This is the Zen project, which was mentioned earlier, which is this EU project, looking at how councils and municipalities across Europe can affect change within the events and festivals organisations. And that's both ones that councils operate themselves, which happens more on the continent than it does here, but also private sector festivals and events. And there are two quite straightforward ways in which, particularly in the festival and events sector, where councils can affect change, and that's through licensing and through grants. Neither of those need any legislation to make any change whatsoever. There's absolutely no reason why, I mean, any event, any festival needs to have, you know, a public entertainment license to operate, whether it's a temporary one or a fixed term one. There's absolutely no reason why within that license it shouldn't have sustainability objectives within it to say you must have a recycling policy, you must have a transport policy, you must, not just have a transport policy, but one which actually drives sustainability, is actually based around reducing CO2 emissions, reducing impact. And the other side then is also on grants. There's absolutely no reason why, you know, and most sectors will be applying for some sort of public grant somewhere. No reason why within those criteria it says, in return for getting this public money, you must be doing this, this and this. Absolutely no reason.
And indeed, it's exactly what the Arts Council, what many of you in this
exactly. So I mean, but it's you know, this can be across the board, and there's no reason why carpet doesn't need any legislation. Just requires a few people in certain positions to actually say, right, we'll just write it in.
Absolutely. Very interesting. So that's more leadership coming from the middle rather than from the top. So very, very, I'd agree. There's a question. Can you say who you are too?
I'm Claire Haskins. I'm from Discover Children's Story Centre. Although this is not related to what I do now, this is actually related to what I used to do. I come from a fair trade background, and we were great believers in consumer power, and that private companies will change what they're doing if their consumers want them to. And I do really believe that we shouldn't buy the products that are not environmentally sound, and we shouldn't actually use the devices. And I think that that's probably, when you have a global economy which isn't legislated globally, our best hope.
I think you're right. I mean, consumer power is important, but consumer power wouldn't have driven us to change how we operate. Because the vast majority of people who come to the festival, whilst they think it's important, wouldn't necessarily not come if we weren't doing these things. And I think I think you are right. Consumer power is very important, but I think we're at that point where you've got the band of people who are doing those things, who will do those things anyway, and it's now the big bulk of people who actually either don't care or don't have the information or haven't got the ability to make a change, which is where you now need to say, well, how do we actually help those? How do we actually start taking those products off the market? Through different ways as well as consumer power. It has to be a combination, I think.
I think I'd agree with what you're saying wholeheartedly. I think the power of pressure is really important, not only on sort of businesses to change their practices, but also I think if you talk to politicians, what they'd say to the media sector is, look, we want to do things, we feel constrained by public opinion, we would go further if we could, if there was an environment out there which allowed us to do so. So, you know, media help us by raising the awareness on these issues. You know, so that's our challenge, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you're back very helpfully to Rose Fenton and Rose Friend. I'm based at Freeword, so I know Rose very well, and I know the initiatives that she's taking, for example, at Freeword. But you know, then you're back to the best possible example being to encourage artists to advocate and to put pressure across the board, government lobbying, consumer understanding. So we're still at the level where the pressure is on to gain the information, partly, as well as to take decisions. So there are things we know that aren't good, but there are other things that we need to put pressure on to find out. And they're the really big questions still, especially for the print and ebook industry, short of saying we no longer publish books. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a small observation, and I'd like to hear Peter's future thing, but a small observation which is really interesting for us who've been around for 7 years is recognising that the mood music has really changed. And when we started, any suggestion at all, any hint that the artists had an instrumental role to play around messaging, around advocating, around communicating the science of or the issues was anathema. It created incredible friction and a sense that the arts were being used to achieve political or issue-based ends. Now that environment, that conversation, that narrative has utterly transformed, and for me this is a really important change, that actually artists now are seeing themselves as being critical actors in this whole space, because they want to be, not because they feel that they're being coerced, but because they want to be, which says something about where the issue is now sitting in the public consciousness, which is where there is a failure of leadership. And it comes back to this: how can we be civic actors, whether it be through grants and middle leaders, or whether it be through our art and our narrative.
But also, as Gemma, who is my lead officer, knows, I was kicking and screaming into thinking about the environment. We're a tiny organisation. So in a way, I'm your ideal person. I've been coerced to be here. I have a huge intellectual interest and a passionate interest in humanity, but when I'm doing my job, I can only do so much, that kind of attitude. So, but what frustrates me is the needing to know exactly where to put energy, and it's not clear in our industry.
Okay. So with a bit of luck, today is the launch of a programme to support specifically, Julie's Bicycle has been supported by the Arts Council for precisely that.
It's brilliant, well done.
Hopefully it'll be a bit easier. Can I just, Peter, your vision of the future?
It was partly, I don't know your name, but you took what I was going to say. I think there is the most important thing that can happen, and perhaps the power that digital and technology and social networking can provide is A, transparency, and then B, power and influence to change. It's still very early days, but once that gets focused and becomes sort of more ethically directed, then that provides the mechanism for change. And I think for us as an industry, it's about more transparency, more information, to be able to highlight what we know and what we don't know, so that we can start to make better and more informed decisions.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
I'm Roseanne Campbell, I'm from Macmillan. I just wanted to know what the most environmentally friendly version of an iPad or ebook would be.
The most environment friendly version?
Yeah, of an electronic device to read your papers, manuscripts, work, emails on. Anyone has the answer?
Well,
if only we could tell you.
but we can tell you some things.
Yes.
There's a piece of work that we can distribute, which is, again, it came out of this group of people involved in publishing and media. We were part of that. Looking at what it didn't try to do was to do a full carbon footprint of digital devices. But what it did do is look at each stage of the device, so the content creation stage, the manufacture, the content creation, and then the use phase. And what it did identify were really basic things like your resolution, the types of resolution that you have on your device, the amount of colours that you use. So these are challenging issues for designers if they choose to minimise the impacts of the actual device. But crucially, the most important thing is about use of your device. So if you are using a device, turn it off. Keep it on standby. Don't use high colour resolution. Only use one. This is basic stuff. And actually, something that you were saying, which is how, what, so much of this actually is common sense. It's just that we're not applying it to the digital sphere. So there are things that you can do, and there's sort of top tips for it. They're all fairly mundane, and they're pretty commonsensical.
If you go on ethical consumer websites,
Yeah.
and look, not just for this, but for many products,
Yeah.
they've done research into not just the environmental impacts, but also the social impacts of where they're being sourced from. That's definitely the best starting point.
And one other question.
My name's Lee. I work for Calvert's. We're a specialist in sustainable printing for lots of small publishers and charities and environmental groups. But my background itself is in publishing. I used to buy printing for a lot of large trade publishers about 10 or so years ago, and a lot of the overriding decisions made in the purchasing was just purely based on unit cost. And environmental considerations weren't top of the agenda. So it's a question for Peter, to saying how has that kind of changed in the last 10 years? I mean, a lot of the printing was done overseas, mainly in the Far East, that kind of thing, which I guess it still happens, but is it still unit cost the main bearing when people are purchasing print for mainstream publishers?
I think one thing that was quite interesting, and in sort of like 2007, 2008, was that a number of publishing houses put together sort of green imprints to see whether there was a way of charging a premium to the consumer to cover perceived additional environmental costs. So Dorling Kindersley did Made with Care, and I think Macmillan did something similar. There were a couple of these. That was instrumental and interesting for two reasons. One, they didn't sell very well. But more importantly was that the lessons that were learned were largely taken into broader procurement practice, so they became sort of mainstream. The production departments, once they're given a direction that this is where we need to go, are very inventive about eradicating sort of that sort of difference. So I know a number of trade publishers, the larger ones who had the ability to negotiate, who've been able to make sure that the environmental credentials are not given up because of cost considerations, and there's been sort of huge movement.
And I think this has changed now. I think our festival bookshop manager used to work for one of the big book chains based in the UK, when they had new staff join, who often came in because they love books, you used to send them down to the cellar for a week, where their job was ripping off the front cover of all the books which were being returned, because the publishers weren't interested in the books, they just wanted the front cover, but they didn't want you to be able to sell the book. Rip the front cover off, sent the front covers back, and then you got your money back for those returned books. And if it lasted a week of ripping covers off books, then they would survive in the bookshop. But I think, that certainly, book returns is a I know from the festival's perspective, we obviously try and order enough to sell for that period, but there always are returns, and it isn't. How much scope is taken into account from the published perspective of the returns coming in and what happens to them and where they go? Is that taken into account in the whole sort of life cycle of a book?
I know that the returns was one of the thorniest issues that was discussed, because it's a value chain discussion. And there was some movement, but not as far as people wanted to go. So that is an area to look at again. I think there are sort of other avenues to go down. So Pearson's an education publisher, for example, has links with Book Aid International, so that rather than sort of destroying books, that they are provided for people who wouldn't commercially be able to afford them. So there are other routes.
I think we're nearly at the end of our time. Does anybody have a burning question that they'd like to ask? In which case we will wrap up. I'd like to say thank you both to Andy and Peter, and obviously to everybody here. It seems to me that there is an awful lot happening, actually, both in the supply chain of the book industry and festival industry, but also in the general zeitgeist of literature. And I suppose the only thing which we've heard a lot of today is how we come together and how we actually muster a collective voice, whether it be an artistic narrative or whether it be an approach to our operations and our supply chains, in order to really start to build a head of steam around this. And I think that all the raw materials are here in front of our noses, just whether or not we can now use them to the good. So thank you very much to everybody here, and to you two very much indeed. There's now a short break for coffee and tea, and then there's three.
We'll have 3 breakouts, two of which will be with Peter and Andy on publishing and digital and events, respectively. It's worth bearing in mind that we know a lot of you come from smaller organisations which don't do events on the scale of Hay, or might publish on a scale much smaller than some of the big commercial publishing houses, and we'll make sure that we kind of can touch upon those points in the discussions. The third breakout group will be with Nick Mercer from the Arvin Foundation, and Arvin have been doing some really fantastic stuff around the future of their buildings, and how they can explore that both in terms of land use and food, the building itself, and also what happens inside them. And Arvin's done quite a bit of work around that, both in their programme and the building. So there will be a discussion with Nick and a presentation from Nick in that group as well. Obviously, you've heard from Lee now, so we do have an expert alongside Peter in terms of print publishing and the supply chain there. So Lee will probably be joining our publishing group, so do use him as a resource if you have further questions as well. And we will be live streaming the publishing and digital conversation for any of our online viewers, so we should acknowledge them. And we are taking questions and comments from Twitter, both for today's discussions and afterwards, so do keep the conversation going with us. But thank you very much. We'll have a short break. We're a bit behind time, but we'll come and give you a heads up in about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Gosh.
There's always more you can do, isn't it?
Sorry? Still running smooth. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I was going to do
Thanks, mate. What I was going to do was grab that one.
Yeah, I've got a couple of bits and pieces of musical stuff there.
Perfect audience. That one onto charge.
Kind of shut down the street.
Yeah. And it's what we can set up another one for the workshop.
Yeah, but I do that.
I don't think we'll do that at lunch. Now, I'm just going to take like one try to get some like networking shots.
Okay, cool.
Did it go down at all?
No.
What's going on with the walking around? Was that a sound issue?
Sorry?
Is there a problem with the sound? At the beginning?
It's, to be honest, it was pretty audible. It wasn't bad. the only bit holding back was talking without the microphone.